Harold Monroe, an 80-year-old Army veteran, finally receives a $7,400 VA disability check after decades of battling bureaucratic neglect for Agent Orange exposure. The money promises a new start, fixing his trailer, paying bills, and visiting his estranged daughter and grandson. At Consolidated Trust Bank, Harold expects a routine deposit, but Emma, a young teller, deems the check suspicious and shreds it without verification, shattering his hopes. Humiliated yet composed, Harold steps outside. Unbeknownst to Emma, her impulsive act triggers consequences. Harold's call to an old comrade sets a storm in motion, hinting at justice. If Harold's story moved you, join us in honoring voices like his. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel to amplify stories of resilience and respect. Your support helps us build a community where veterans and everyday heroes are heard. Comment below, share your story, let's make their legacy loud. Harold Monroe stepped out of his weathered aluminum trailer, the dry Bakersfield air brushing against his lined face. At 80, his back bore a slight stoop. His hands were rough from decades of labor, but his eyes held a quiet fire, a remnant of the soldier who once read maps by moonlight amid the threat of mortar fire. The U.S. Treasury check in his jacket pocket felt like a talisman, heavy with the promise of redemption after years of struggle. He'd pressed his best shirt, shaved with care, and walked to the bank with a cautious hope flickering in his chest, a hope he hadn't dared to nurture in decades. His life had been one of quiet service. In the 1960s, Harold endured 2 tours near the Korean demilitarized zone, where the cold was as relentless as the tension. Later, during Desert Storm, he served in logistics, ensuring soldiers had the tools to fight. He wasn't a hero in the spotlight, but a man who kept the machine running. His work as vital as any trigger pulled. Now, living alone in a faded trailer on the edge of Bakersfield, California, he existed in a world of leaning mailboxes and barking dogs, content with simplicity, but weighed down by a 20-year bureaucratic battle. After Desert Storm, his body began to falter. Coughing fits, skin lesions, and nerve pain plagued him, symptoms he linked to Agent Orange exposure during a supply mission near Kuwait. He filed a VA claim, hoping for relief, but was met with delays, lost documents, and silence. Each letter from the VA was a fresh wound, each year of waiting a reminder of being forgotten. Yet Harold persisted, driven by a soldier's discipline and a belief that his service deserved acknowledgement. In 2023, after public pressure forced the VA to revisit backlogged cases, Harold's file resurfaced. His exposure was confirmed, and he was awarded $76,000 in retroactive disability compensation. The check was more than money, it was validation, a declaration that his pain mattered. He dreamed of fixing his trailer's sagging roof, paying off medical bills, and visiting his daughter and grandson, Caleb, in Oregon, a boy he knew only through photos. At the bank, Harold presented the check with quiet pride. The young teller, her eyes fixed on her screen, barely acknowledged him. Her frown deepened as she scanned the document. "Sir, this doesn't look right," she said, her voice cold. "The numbers seem off. I'll have to destroy it." Harold's heart lurched. He leaned forward, hands pressing against the counter, his voice steady but urgent. "That's a U.S. Treasury check, miss. It's real. I earned it. I've waited half my life for it." He thought of his service, his pain, the grandson he longed to meet. This check was his proof, his future. The teller didn't hesitate. With a mechanical whir, the shredder devoured the check, spitting out strips of paper that carried Harold's dreams. His hands trembled, grief swallowing his anger. He felt invisible, his life's worth reduced to scraps. The teller moved on, oblivious to the devastation she'd wrought. Harold left the bank, his steps heavy, his mind replaying the shredder's snarl. 5 minutes later, chaos erupted. Black sedans screeched to a halt, and federal agents stormed the bank, their voices sharp as they questioned the teller. Her indifference crumbled into panic as she learned the check's significance. Harold, unaware, trudged home, his heart heavy, but his resolve unbroken. From a payphone, he called the Treasury, his voice calm but firm, refusing to let his lifeline vanish without a fight. The agent's arrival was proof that Harold's struggle hadn't gone unnoticed. His quiet persistence had sparked a reckoning, exposing the cost of carelessness. The teller faced the consequences of shredding a soldier's hope, while Harold, ever unassuming, carried on, a testament to a man who had fought for justice across wars and years of silence. Harold Monroe clutched the manila envelope tightly, his weathered fingers tracing the edges where his VA ID and driver's license nestled alongside a check that felt heavier than its paper should allow. For over 4 decades, he'd been a loyal customer of Consolidated Trust Bank, a place that had seen him through lean years and fleeting moments of stability. Today, he walked toward its familiar glass doors with no expectation of fanfare, no hunger for recognition, just a quiet resolve to deposit the check and move one step closer to mending the frayed threads of his life. He wasn't chasing glory or seeking a spotlight. Yet, as he stepped into the bank's lobby, the world was poised to notice him in ways he couldn't yet fathom. The envelope had arrived the day before, unassuming in its plain white exterior, but Harold sensed its weight before he even broke the seal. The embossed seal of the U.S. Department of the Treasury and the bold official font in the top left corner stirred a flicker of recognition in his chest. He'd seen letters like this before, decades of them, each carrying a different kind of weight: denials, requests for more forms, or vague promises of review. But this one was different. As he slid it open at his small Formica kitchen table, the one with a chipped corner and a placemat faded by years of Bakersfield sun, his breath caught. Inside was a check for $76,400. The number hit him like a slow-rolling wave, not with a crash, but with a deep, resonant pull. He sank into the chair, the creak of its worn frame echoing the years he'd spent waiting. Harold didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence in his modest trailer held enough weight as he exhaled a long, trembling breath, the kind that carried the exhaustion of decades. He read the accompanying letter twice, its bureaucratic tone, phrases like retroactive compensation and expanded Agent Orange exposure guidelines, feeling cold and distant, like a stranger delivering life-changing news. But beneath the jargon, the meaning was clear. The government had finally acknowledged him. For years, Harold had carried the invisible scars of his service, the lingering effects of Agent Orange that no one could see but he could feel in his bones, his lungs, his sleepless nights. He'd navigated the VA's labyrinth of appeals, evaluations, and endless hold times on hotlines that looped him back to square one. Each call, each form, each rejection had chipped away at his hope until anger gave way to resignation. He'd stopped expecting justice. He'd simply endured, like so many of his fellow veterans, their stories fading into the background of a world that moved on. But now the check was real. Its crisp edges and printed numbers as a tangible promise of something better. As he sat at that worn table, Harold's mind churned with possibilities, each one a small rebellion against the years of scraping by. He grabbed a yellow notepad, its edges curled from age, and began a list. First, he'd fixed the roof of his trailer, which leaked every winter, leaving puddles that mocked his efforts to keep things together. Then, the medical bills, those relentless reminders of his failing health, stacked in a drawer he avoided opening. A new water heater, too. The old one had given up months ago, forcing him to boil water for baths. But the last item, the one he underlined with a shaky hand, was the one that made his heart ache. Visit Maggie and Caleb. Maggie, his daughter, had left Bakersfield for Eugene, Oregon, over a decade ago, chasing a life that felt out of reach in their dusty hometown. The distance between them wasn't just miles. It was a slow-growing chasm of missed calls, unspoken hurts, and the kind of silence that settles in when pride and pain collide. Harold hadn't been the father he wanted to be. Not after the war, not after the years of struggling to keep his head above water. Maggie had a son now, Caleb, a 10-year-old boy who knew his grandfather only through faded Polaroids and the occasional video call, the connection grainy and faltering, like Harold's own memories. The thought of Caleb, of showing up not as a ghost from the past, but as a grandfather with something to offer, lit a spark in Harold's chest. He could buy a bus ticket, bring a gift, maybe a model airplane kit like the ones he'd loved as a kid. He could arrive with dignity, not as a man weighed down by years of waiting. The next morning, Harold rose before dawn, his body stiff but his mind sharp with purpose. He ironed his only good shirt, A faded button-down he'd worn to every important moment since the 80s, its collar still crisp despite the years. He tucked the check, VAID, and driver's license into the manila envelope, checking twice to ensure they were secure. He glanced at the bus schedule to Eugene, tracing the times with a calloused finger, but he didn't book a ticket yet. First, he needed to deposit the check and to make it real in his account, to anchor this newfound hope in something concrete. He stepped out into the Bakersfield morning, the air already warm with the promise of another scorching day, and made his way to Consolidated Trust Bank. The bank had been a constant in Harold's life since 1983, through its move to a new location, its rebranded logos, and the revolving door of tellers who never stayed long enough for him to learn their names. Loyalty kept him there, a stubborn tether to a time when things felt simpler. Habit played its part too, the comfort of routine in a world that often felt unsteady. As he pushed through the glass doors, he nodded to the security guard, a young man whose name he didn't know but whose face had become familiar. The lobby was quieter than he'd expected for a weekday morning, the air cool and tinged with the faint scent of coffee and printer ink. The hum of an aging HVAC unit droned overhead, a steady reminder of the world's imperfections. Harold stepped into line, the envelope tucked under his arm, his posture straight despite the ache in his back. He was patient, as always, a man who had learned to wait without complaint. This was supposed to be a simple errand, a deposit, a transaction, a quiet step toward rebuilding what time and circumstance had eroded. But as he stood in that line, the weight of the envelope seemed to grow, as if it carried not just money but the promise of redemption, of reconnection, of a life no longer defined by waiting. Harold had no inkling that this ordinary moment would unravel into something extraordinary, that the world was about to shift beneath his feet in ways he couldn't predict. The bank lobby, with its clean walls and muted sounds, was a stage set for a day that would change everything, not because of the check, but because of what came next. The bank's interior was a study in dull beige, a space crafted to exude security, yet stripped of personality. Like a waiting room for life's most forgettable moments. Harold Monroe stood in the queue, his gnarled hands cradling a manila envelope with the kind of reverence one might show a fragile heirloom. Inside it was his check, a hard-earned acknowledgement of years of sacrifice. At 73, Harold carried himself with a quiet dignity, his weathered army jacket hanging loosely on his frame, its faded olive green a testament to battles fought long ago. His eyes, sharp despite the creases around them, scanned the room. Young professionals tapped impatiently at their phones, retirees shuffled forward with practiced patience, and a mother gently rocked a stroller, humming softly to her child. No one spared him a glance. To them, he was just another elderly man, unremarkable, blending into the hum of everyday life. But Harold felt the weight of the envelope in his hands, a tangible symbol of justice delayed but finally delivered, or so he had believed. His heart thrummed with a mix of anticipation and unease. For decades, he'd navigated the labyrinth of bureaucracy at the Department of Veterans Affairs, each form filled out, each appeal denied, chipping away at his hope. When the letter arrived last week, its official seal gleaming under his kitchen light, Harold had sat at his worn dining table, hands shaking as he read the words, retroactive disability pay. It wasn't just money, it was validation, a government's belated admission that his service, his pain, had mattered. He'd allowed himself a rare smile, imagining the relief it would bring. Medical bills paid, a new coat for winter, maybe even a small donation to the local VFW. Now, standing in line, he clung to that fragile optimism, though a knot of doubt twisted in his gut. He'd learned long ago that the world didn't always honor promises. When the teller's window opened, a young woman beckoned him forward. Her name tag read Emma, and she couldn't have been older than 24, her face smooth and unlined, her blonde hair pulled into a neat ponytail. Her smile was bright but mechanical, honed by training manuals and customer service seminars. It was the kind of smile that greeted everyone equally, without warmth or curiosity. Harold stepped up, his boots scuffing softly on the polished floor. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice steady but warm, a nod to the manners his mother had instilled in him decades ago. "I'd like to deposit this check, please." He slid the envelope across the counter with care, as if handing over a piece of himself. Emma's fingers flicked open the envelope with practiced efficiency, her nails a soft pink against the paper. But when she pulled out the check and her eyes landed on the bold black print, the government seal and the staggering figure, her smile faltered. Her brows knitted together and a flicker of something, doubt perhaps or suspicion, crossed her face. Harold watched her, his chest tightening. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of bureaucrats and doctors who dismissed his claims without a second thought. "This is quite a large amount," Emma said, her voice tinged with the hesitation as she blinked up at him. "Yes, ma'am," Harold replied, keeping his tone even, despite the unease creeping into his thoughts. "It's retroactive disability pay from the VA. Been a long time coming." He offered a small, hopeful smile, wanting to bridge the gap between them, to make her see him not as a stranger, but as a man who'd earned this moment. But Emma's expression didn't soften. She held the check up to the light, tilting it as if expecting to find some hidden flaw, then slid it under a UV scanner with a faint hum. Her fingers moved to her keyboard, tapping rapidly, her eyes fixed on the screen. The absence of her smile felt like a door closing. Harold stood patiently, though his mind churned. He wondered what she saw in him. An old man with a story too big to believe? Did she think he was trying to pull one over on her, on the bank? The thought stung, a sharp reminder of all the times he'd been doubted, his service reduced to paperwork and skepticism. He straightened his shoulders, drawing on the discipline that had carried him through jungles and nightmares, determined not to let his frustration show. After a moment, Emma's voice cut through his thoughts, flat and devoid of the earlier politeness. "I'm sorry, sir, but this check is highly irregular." She tapped the paper with a manicured finger, her tone shifting into the clipped cadence of corporate protocol. "The paper doesn't feel standard. The routing numbers don't follow the usual format, and this signature, it doesn't match the typical VA disbursement styles we process." Harold's eyebrow arched, a flicker of indignation sparking in his chest. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, that check came straight from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It's a United States Treasury document. You're welcome to call and verify it if you need to." He met her gaze, hoping she'd see the truth in his eyes, the weight of a lifetime behind his words. Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't need to," she said briskly, her voice carrying the certainty of someone following a script. "We have procedures for handling potentially fraudulent instruments, and this," she tapped the check again, harder this time, "raises too many red flags." The word fraudulent landed like a slap, and Harold felt a surge of anger, quickly tempered by the exhaustion of fighting battles no one else seemed to see. He reached into his jacket, his movements deliberate, and placed his veteran's ID and driver's license on the counter. The cards were worn, their edges soft from years in his wallet, but his name was clear, matching the check exactly. "My name's on that check," he said, his voice low but steady. "These match. I've been banking here longer than you've been alive, young lady." There was no malice in his words, only a quiet plea for her to understand, to see him. But Emma barely glanced at the IDs. Her eyes flicked to them for a moment before returning to the check, as if the documents were irrelevant. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her tone now cold and unyielding, "but I'm going to have to destroy this." Harold blinked, his breath catching in his throat. "I beg your pardon," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, disbelief flooding his senses. The word destroy echoed in his mind, absurd and unthinkable. This wasn't just paper, it was his due, his recognition, his lifeline. "It's policy," Emma replied, her voice cool and confident, as if reciting a rule she'd never questioned. "When a check is deemed suspicious, it must be voided and removed from circulation. That includes shredding. We can't risk it being presented again elsewhere." She spoke with the detached authority of someone insulated by procedure, unaware of or indifferent to the devastation her words carried. Before Harold could find his voice, before he could protest or plead, Emma turned to the heavy-duty shredder beside her desk. It was a squat, industrial machine, meant for internal documents and discarded forms, not for dreams or justice. With a single decisive motion, she fed the check into its maw. The blades clicked to life, a faint whirring filling the air as white fragments, shreds of what had been Harold's long-awaited redemption, fluttered into the bin below. The sound pierced Harold's heart, a visceral wound that left him frozen. He stared at the machine, at the bin, at the tiny pieces of paper that had once held so much promise. His hands, still resting on the counter, trembled, not from age, but from a deep, aching betrayal that reached back through years of sacrifice and struggle. He felt the eyes of the other customers on him, their murmurs and gasps a distant hum. A woman behind him whispered something, her voice thick with shock. A man muttered under his breath, his words indistinct but heavy with disapproval. Even the security guard, stationed near the door, shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering near his belt as if unsure what to do. Emma, however, remained unfazed. She shrugged, a small, careless gesture that felt like a second blow. "If it was legitimate," she said, her voice light, almost dismissive, "you can always request a replacement, but we can't process this today." Her words were hollow, a rote response that failed to grasp the magnitude of what she'd done. Harold's gaze lifted to meet hers, not with anger, but with a quiet, piercing disbelief. He saw her youth, her certainty, her complete detachment from the man standing before her. In that moment, he felt the weight of every dismissal, every form letter, every closed door he'd faced since coming home from the war. He picked up his ID and license slowly, his fingers unsteady, each movement deliberate as he fought to hold himself together. He wanted to speak, to tell her what that check had meant, to make her understand the years of pain and patience it represented. But the words wouldn't come. They caught at his throat, tangled in a grief too deep for speech. Without a word, he turned, his back straight as ever, and walked toward the glass doors. The bank's sterile air gave way to the heat of the outside world, the sun blazing down with an intensity that seemed to burn through him. Or perhaps it was the anger, the sorrow, the betrayal that seared his chest, a fire kindled by the careless destruction of something he'd fought so hard to claim. He stepped onto the sidewalk, the world blurring around him, and kept walking, carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of unacknowledged wounds. Harold Monroe settled onto the cold, unyielding metal bench anchored to the sidewalk just outside the bank, its surface baking under the relentless California sun. The parking lot before him shimmered with heat, distorting the air like a mirage. His hands, still quivering with a quiet rage, rested heavily on his knees, fingers curling slightly as if grasping for something lost. For a long, heavy moment he was silent, his chest rising and falling with deliberate breaths. This wasn't the hot, fleeting anger of youth that burned out quickly. No, this was something deeper, colder. A bone-deep ache forged over decades of being overlooked, of serving faithfully only to be rendered invisible. It was the kind of stillness that settled in a man when someone crossed a line that should have been sacred, a line drawn in the blood of sacrifice and the quiet dignity of endurance. Inside, Harold's mind churned. The teller's dismissive tone still echoed in his ears, the mechanical whine of the shredder tearing through his check. A check he'd earned through years of sweat and loyalty felt like a blade across his pride. He wasn't just humiliated, he was erased. Yet beneath the sting, a steely resolve took root. He wasn't done. Not yet. With a slow, deliberate inhale, Harold reached into his worn jacket and pulled out an old flip phone, its edges scuffed from years of careful use. His thumb hovered over the keys, trembling not with fear, but with the weight of what he was about to do. The phone held few numbers, but one stood alone at the top of the list, untouched for years yet never forgotten. He pressed it. The phone rang once, then twice, each tone stretching into eternity. A click broke the silence, followed by a voice, calm, familiar, weathered by time but unmistakable. "Easton here." Harold's lips parted, his voice low but steady, carrying the cadence of a man who'd faced worse than this. "Ray, it's Harold Monroe." A pause hung between them, thick with unspoken history. Then Raymond Easton's voice sharpened, cutting through the distance of years. "Harold, what's going on?" Harold spoke slowly, each word measured, laying out the story with painful clarity. The check, the teller's indifference, the shredder's cruel efficiency, the humiliation that burned like acid in his chest. As he spoke, he stared at the cracked pavement, his free hand clenching into a fist, nails biting into his palm. He didn't need to embellish. The truth was raw enough. On the other end, Raymond Easton listened without interruption, but Harold could sense the shift in his old friend's demeanor. It was in the subtle change of his breathing, a tightening, a quiet fury that didn't need raised voices to be felt. Raymond had always carried that kind of anger, the kind that simmered beneath a composed exterior, reserved for moments when justice had been trampled. Harold could picture him now, jaw set, eyes narrowing, the same look he'd worn in the desert all those years ago. "You're at the bank now?" Raymond asked, his voice clipped but controlled. "Outside, sitting on the bench," Harold replied, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the heat blurred the world. "Don't move," Raymond said, his tone sharp and immediate. "I mean it. Stay right where you are." For a fleeting moment, Harold's mind slipped back to 1991, to the Gulf War's relentless sands. He was a senior sergeant then, steady under pressure, guiding a munitions convoy through a blinding sandstorm in southern Iraq. Raymond, a young colonel, had been in command when a wrong turn left them vulnerable to mortar fire. The men were rattled, disoriented, teetering on the edge of panic. But Harold, with nothing but a compass, a greased pencil, and a torn map, had rerouted the entire convoy to safety. 47 soldiers owed him their lives that day. Raymond had gripped his shoulder afterward, his eyes fierce with gratitude. "You've got my word, Monroe," he'd said. That promise had bound them ever since. Now, decades later, Harold sat on that bench, his honor bruised, his trust shredded like the check he'd presented. The memory of that desert victory clashed with the sting of today's defeat, and yet a flicker of hope stirred within him. Raymond's voice came through the phone again, tighter now, laced with resolve. "You gave me your word back then. I owe you mine now, and I still carry a bit more weight than I did in 91. Give me 10 minutes. Harold closed the phone with a soft snap, folding his hands in his lap. He didn't know exactly what Raymond would do, but he knew the man's character. Unyielding, principled, the kind of person who didn't make promises lightly. That was enough. Harold remained on the bench, unmoving, his eyes scanning the parking lot with the quiet vigilance of a soldier who'd never quite left the battlefield. The sun beat down, sweat beading on his brow, but he didn't shift or fidget. 8 minutes passed, maybe 10. He didn't check his watch. Time felt irrelevant. His focus was absolute. Then the sedans appeared. 2 black, low-slung vehicles with tinted windows and unmarked plates glided into the bank's parking lot. They didn't screech or roar. Their arrival was deliberate, precise, like a well-executed maneuver. They pulled to a stop with quiet authority, and Harold's pulse quickened, though his expression remained impassive. 4 figures emerged, 2 men, 2 women, all clad in tailored dark suits that spoke of power and purpose. Sunglasses shielded their eyes, earpieces gleamed subtly, and their strides carried the confidence of people accustomed to command. One woman clutched a thin black briefcase, its leather catching the sunlight. One of the men wore a lapel pin shaped like an eagle in flight, a detail Harold's sharp eyes didn't miss. They didn't move like ordinary visitors. They moved like they already owned the space they were entering. Harold adjusted his cap, the faintest hint of satisfaction tugging at his heart. He didn't smile, he wasn't the type, but inside he felt a quiet vindication. Whatever was about to happen, it would be enough. The moment the glass doors of First Consolidated Trust swung open, a palpable shift rippled through the bank's atmosphere, as if the air itself had thickened with tension. The usual hum of activity, soft conversations between tellers and customers, the rhythmic tapping of keyboards, the rustle of papers, fell silent, like a radio abruptly switched off. Heads turned, eyes widened, and a collective hush settled over the lobby. Behind her teller window, Emma Caldwell, a young woman with a knack for numbers but a lingering unease about confrontation, glanced up from her transaction screen. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart stuttering as she registered the group of sharply dressed strangers striding purposefully toward the counter. Their presence was commanding, their movements precise, and the sight of them sent a shiver of uncertainty down her spine. She wasn't sure what she was seeing, but it felt wrong, like the opening scene of a storm. The group, 4 agents, 2 men and 2 women, each exuding an air of unyielding authority, didn't bother with pleasantries. Without raising their voices, they flashed credentials that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Federal identification cards from the Treasury Department, Office of the Controller of the Currency, Internal Audit Division. The lead agent, a woman with a steely gaze and a clipboard clutched like a weapon, scanned the room before her voice cut through the silence. "Manager on site?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to slice through the nervous energy in the air. Carl Devlin, the branch manager, was seated at his desk in the glass-walled office at the far end of the lobby. A man in his mid-40s with a penchant for overly starched shirts and a perpetual air of mild exhaustion, Carl had been reviewing a spreadsheet when the agents entered. His head snapped up at the sound of the woman's voice, his stomach lurching as he caught sight of the credentials. Before he could fully process the situation, two agents were already at his door, stepping into his office with the confidence of people who knew they held all the cards. Their faces were unreadable, their movements deliberate, and Carl felt a bead of sweat form at the base of his neck. He forced a smile, but it wavered, betraying the anxiety gnawing at him. What could the Treasury Department want with a small-town branch like this? Meanwhile, the other two agents approached Emma's teller window. She stood frozen, her hands hovering over the counter, as if unsure whether to reach for something or retreat entirely. The man in front of her, tall and imposing with a voice that carried the weight of authority, fixed his gaze on her. "Miss Emma Caldwell?" he asked, his tone neutral, but laced with an undercurrent that made her chest tighten. She nodded, her eyes darting between the agents, her mind racing to make sense of the moment. Her mouth felt dry, her pulse hammering in her ears. "You'll come with us, please," the man continued, gesturing toward a side room with a nod. It wasn't a request. Emma's voice trembled as she stammered, "Is this about the check?" Her words came out too fast, too unsteady, and she immediately regretted them. The woman agent, standing just behind her colleague, responded with a voice as flat as a sheet of ice. "We'll discuss that shortly." They escorted Emma to a small, windowless conference room just off the main lobby, the kind of space usually reserved for loan approvals or staff meetings. As the door clicked shut behind her, Emma's hands began to shake, her fingers twisting together in her lap. She felt like a child caught breaking a rule she didn't fully understand, and the weight of her uncertainty pressed down on her like a physical force. Back in the lobby, the audit team wasted no time. They commandeered Carl's terminal, their fingers flying across the keyboard as screens flickered with data. One agent, a wiry man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, pulled up the surveillance footage from Emma's teller station. The high-definition image was unmistakable. Harold Monroe, an older man with a weathered face and a quiet dignity, stood at Emma's window earlier that day. He had presented a treasury check, his movements calm and deliberate as he placed his documents on the counter. His voice, captured faintly by the microphone, was steady, polite, asking for the check to be processed. Emma, however, had acted without hesitation or consultation. No call to a manager, no attempt to verify the document's authenticity. Instead, she had fed the check into the shredder, the machine's mechanical whine slicing through the footage like an accusation. The agent replayed the clip, his expression unreadable, but his silence deafening. Inside the side room, Emma sat across from Agent Malik, the man who had addressed her earlier. His presence was imposing, not because of his size, but because of the calm, unrelenting focus in his eyes. He leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the table, and asked, "Why did you shred the check, Miss Caldwell?" His voice was measured, but it carried a weight that made Emma feel as though the walls were closing in. She swallowed hard, her mind scrambling for an explanation that wouldn't sound as flimsy as it felt. I thought it was fake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands were trembling now, and she clasped them tightly to steady herself. "The paper felt wrong, you know. It didn't feel like the checks we usually see. And the amount, it was so large. We don't get treasury checks like that here. Not often. I thought I was protecting the bank." Agent Malik's expression didn't change. "Did you scan the routing number?" he asked, his tone as steady as a metronome. Emma nodded, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. And, "Yes, but it didn't match what I'm used to seeing. The system didn't flag it as valid, or at least I didn't think it did." Her voice wavered as she spoke, her mind replaying the moment in a frantic loop. She had been so sure, so certain that she was doing the right thing. Now doubt crept in, curling around her thoughts like smoke. "Did you contact your manager?" Malik pressed, his gaze never leaving her. Emma shook her head, her stomach twisting. "No, I didn't want it to be cashed if it was fraudulent. I thought I was following policy. The words felt hollow even to her, a weak defense against the growing realization that she had made a terrible mistake. Agent Malik's eyes narrowed slightly, and he flipped open a binder with a deliberate motion. Page 17, paragraph 3 of your bank's protocol for questionable instruments, he said, his voice cutting through her excuses. He slid the binder across the table, pointing to a highlighted section. In all cases involving suspected federal documents, escalate immediately to a floor supervisor or utilize the designated federal verification hotline. Destruction of federal instruments is prohibited without explicit managerial approval or a confirmed Treasury fraud flag. Emma's eyes widened as she read the policy, her heart sinking. She remembered skimming through the employee handbook during her onboarding, nodding along to the endless pages of procedures without fully absorbing them. She had been eager to start, to prove herself, to fit into the rhythm of the bank. Now that oversight felt like principled, like a betrayal of her own instincts. She looked down at the table, her face burning with shame. Back in the lobby, Carl Devlin was drowning in his own anxiety. The agents had taken over his office, printing out records of every check processed at Emma's station over the past 72 hours. Their movements were methodical, their questions pointed, and Carl felt the weight of their scrutiny like a physical burden. He had always prided himself on running a tight ship, but now, with the Treasury Department tearing through his systems, he felt exposed, vulnerable, as if his carefully constructed world was unraveling. The camera feeds were downloaded onto a secure drive, and a call had been placed to Consolidated Trust's regional headquarters. Carl stood by, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, trying to maintain a semblance of control. But the agent's efficiency was unnerving, their silence more intimidating than any accusations. When one of them announced, "Miss Caldwell is suspended effective immediately," Carl's heart sank. He liked Emma. She was young, eager, maybe a little naive, but she had potential. Now her career hung in the balance, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he should have done more to guide her. But the final blow came when another agent added, "The Treasury Secretary has personally requested a preliminary report by the end of business today." The words landed like a thunderclap, and Carl's mind reeled. The Treasury Secretary? For a single check? The implications were staggering, and he couldn't fathom how this had escalated so quickly. Outside on a bench across the street, Harold Monroe sat like a statue, his weathered face betraying no emotion. An hour earlier, he had stood at Emma's window, presenting a Treasury check that represented years of hard-earned restitution. He had been calm, polite, expecting a routine transaction. Instead, he had watched in disbelief as Emma shredded the check without a word of explanation. Now, as he observed the black sedans parked outside the bank, their tinted windows reflecting the midday sun, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The system that had failed him so abruptly had sprung into action with a speed and force he hadn't anticipated. The agents had descended on the bank like a swarm, their efficiency a stark contrast to the carelessness that had brought him here. Inside, the bank was a hive of tension. The agents had taken over the front desk, their laptops and briefcases spread out like an occupying force. The other tellers exchanged nervous glances, their whispers barely audible over the hum of the agent's work. Carl stood frozen, watching the scene unfold, his mind racing with questions he didn't dare ask. Emma, still in the side room, sat with her head bowed, the weight of her mistake pressing down on her like a physical force. She had wanted to do the right thing, to protect the bank, but now she faced the consequences of a decision made in haste. Harold, unmoving on his bench, watched the sedans with a steady gaze. There was no anger in his expression, no bitterness, only a quiet resolve. The system had failed him, but it was correcting itself now, faster and louder than anyone in the bank could have predicted. And as the agents continued their work, Harold knew this was only the beginning. The black sedans remained parked, a silent promise that the matter was far from resolved. Harold Monroe didn't need to scrutinize the scene unfolding before him to understand its weight. The air itself seemed to thrum with a restless electric tension, a silent cacophony of dread that rippled through the crowd outside the bank. It was the kind of atmosphere that I spoke of, a collective realization, people grasping in real time that they'd crossed a line, committed an unforgivable error. Harold's chest tightened, not with anger but with a weary recognition. He'd felt this before, decades ago, in moments when the world seemed to turn its back on him. His hands, calloused from years of service, rested quietly in his lap, but his heart raced with the quiet fury of a man who'd been forced to prove his worth one too many times. Minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the bank swung open, slicing through the thick silence. Emma emerged first, her steps hesitant, almost mechanical. She wasn't being shoved or manhandled, but the two federal agents flanking her, one just behind, the other at her side, left no doubt that her freedom was conditional. Her usual poise, the confident tilt of her chin that Harold had noticed when he'd first approached her teller window, was gone. Her shoulders sagged under an invisible weight, her face drained of color, her jaw set in a rigid line. She refused to meet Harold's gaze, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the bank steps. But Harold knew she felt his presence, knew she was acutely aware of the man she'd dismissed so carelessly earlier that day. Inside Emma's mind was a storm of regret and fear. She'd been so sure of herself, so certain that her suspicion was justified. Now that certainty had crumbled, leaving her exposed, humiliated, and terrified of what came next. Inside the bank's polished lobby, Carl Devlin, the branch manager, stood frozen, clutching a single sheet of paper that trembled slightly in his hand. A regional executive hovered at his shoulder, whispering urgently, her words sharp and insistent. Carl's face was a mask of shock, his eyes wide like a man who'd just been blindsided by a blow he hadn't seen coming. He'd always prided himself on running a tight ship, on being the kind of manager who could navigate any crisis. But this was a disaster of his own making, or at least one he'd failed to prevent. He wouldn't be fired today, the agents had made that clear, but the damage was done. They'd recommended immediate probation and mandatory federal compliance retraining, a bureaucratic slap on the wrist that felt more like a public flogging. Carl's stomach churned with the realization that his reputation, so carefully built over years, had been shattered in a single afternoon. He'd never be trusted again, not by his superiors, not by his staff. He was, in their eyes, a corporate soldier who'd faltered in the line of duty, caught in the crossfire of someone else's mistake. The glass doors hissed shut, sealing Carl and his shame inside. The agents stepped fully into the sunlight, their expressions unreadable, but their posture commanding. One of them, a tall man with a clipped mustache, caught Harold's eye and offered a subtle nod. It wasn't a grand gesture, no salute or handshake, but it carried a quiet respect, an acknowledgement of a battle won not with fists but with unwavering resolve. Harold felt a flicker of warmth in his chest, a rare moment of validation that he tucked away like a precious keepsake. Then his phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. He reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate care, his fingers brushing the worn fabric as he retrieved the device. The screen glowed with the words, U.S. Treasury Private Line. Harold's breath caught. Even after all these years, the weight of authority still stirred something deep within him, an old soldier's instinct to stand at attention. He answered, his voice steady but soft. Monroe. Harold, came a voice on the other end, firm yet warm, like a hand extended in camaraderie. This is Secretary Daniels. Harold's spine straightened instinctively, his grip tightening on the phone. The secretary's tone was one of command, but there was an undercurrent of sincerity that made Harold listen closely. I've just reviewed the preliminary report from our agents on site, Daniels continued. Let me be perfectly clear. This isn't just about a check. This is about respect. It's about how our institutions treat the men and women who've carried this nation on their backs. And I am deeply, profoundly sorry for what you endured today. Harold was silent, his throat tight with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. He'd spent so many years swallowing his pain, burying his disappointments, that this apology, this recognition, felt almost foreign. Daniels didn't pause long. We've already processed a full replacement payment, he said. It's being deposited electronically into your account. You'll see it by the end of the day. $7,400, the same amount, no delays. Harold exhaled, a slow, shuddering breath that released a tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Thank you, sir, he managed, his voice rough but steady. No, Daniels replied, his tone resolute. Thank you, Staff Sergeant, for your patience, your service, and for reminding us what happens when people forget who they're serving. The call ended abruptly, the line going silent with the same crisp efficiency it had begun. Harold lowered the phone, his eyes lifting to the sky. It was clear now, a vast expanse of blue unbroken by clouds. The breeze, once sharp and biting, had softened, carrying a warmth that seemed to seep into his bones. The check that had been treated as a burden, a mere piece of paper to be questioned and doubted, had been restored, not just in its monetary value, but in its deeper significance. It was no longer just a payment. It was a symbol of respect, of gratitude, of a debt long overdue. For the first time in what felt like forever, Harold Monroe didn't feel like a forgotten soldier, a relic of wars past. He felt seen, his sacrifices acknowledged, his dignity restored. Harold's story didn't spread because of a single check. It struck a chord because it laid bare a truth that had been festering in the shadows of the American conscience for generations. The quiet, insidious neglect of those who'd served. From the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq, from the sands of Kuwait to the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, veterans had returned not to parades or gratitude, but to silence, indifference, and sometimes outright hostility. Ask any Vietnam vet what it was like to step off the plane in 1972, and you'd hear stories of shame, not their own, but a nation's. They faced jeers instead of cheers, protesters who couldn't separate the war from the warrior. And so, like Harold, they buried their pain, carried it silently, and moved forward because that's what soldiers do. Harold Monroe stepped through the glass doors of the bank, his weathered hands clutching a government-issued check. The weight of it felt heavier than the thin paper it was printed on, as if it carried the burden of decades. Years of service, sacrifice, and the endless waiting that followed. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one a testament to a body that had endured more than most could fathom. The Gulf War had been a fleeting storm in the public's eye, short, sharp, and broadcast in grainy footage across living rooms in 1991. Americans had cheered from their sofas, their pride swelling as tanks rolled across deserts on their screens. But for Harold, and thousands like him, the war didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. It lingered in his bones, in the strange rashes that bloomed across his skin, in the shortness of breath that crept up on quiet nights, in the neurological fog that made simple decisions feel like wading through mud. Gulf War Syndrome, they called it, though it took the government over a decade to even acknowledge its existence. Harold's heart carried the ache of that dismissal, the sting of a nation that had moved on, while he and his fellow veterans were left to grapple with invisible wounds. The bank was quiet that morning, the hum of fluorescent lights blending with the soft clatter of keyboards. Harold approached the teller's counter, his veteran ID and check laid out like an offering. He didn't expect fanfare, he never had. His life had been one of quiet endurance, of standing in lines, of waiting for promises to be fulfilled. The check represented more than money. It was a lifeline, a hard-won acknowledgement of his service after years of navigating a labyrinth of paperwork, delayed claims, and unanswered calls. His mind flickered with memories of those battles, not the ones fought in deserts, but the ones fought in VA waiting rooms, on hold with hotlines that buzzed with static, in the face of bureaucrats who seemed to see him as a number rather than a man. He thought of the others too, the countless veterans whose stories echoed his own. The ones who returned from Operations Allied Force, Iraqi freedom, and enduring freedom, carrying not just medals but the weight of burn pit exposure, traumatic brain injuries, and PTSD that gnawed at their souls. He thought of the suicide hotlines that rang unanswered, the clinics with too few staff and too many patients, the endless forms that seemed designed to exhaust rather than assist. The teller, Emma Caldwell, barely glanced at him. Her eyes darted to the check, her brow furrowing with suspicion. To her, it was just another transaction, another moment in a day filled with numbers and procedures. But to Harold, it was everything. Emma's fingers hesitated over the check, her mind racing with the protocols she'd been trained to follow. She didn't see the man before her, the lines etched into his face, the quiet dignity in his posture, the weight of a life spent serving. She saw only a document that didn't fit her expectations, a potential risk in a world of fraud alerts and compliance checklists. Fear, not malice, guided her hand as she reached for the shredder. She didn't pause to ask questions, didn't consider the veteran ID he'd presented, didn't think about the human being standing before her. In one swift motion, she fed the check into the machine, its mechanical whine slicing through the silence of the bank. To her, it was a precaution. To Harold, it was a betrayal. The sound of the shredder hit Harold like a physical blow. His chest tightened, not with anger, but with a deep, aching sorrow. This wasn't just about the check. It was about every unreturned call from the VA, every denied claim, every moment he'd been made to feel like his service meant nothing. He stood there motionless, his eyes fixed on the spot where the check had disappeared. In that moment, he was every veteran who'd been forgotten, every soldier who'd come home to a country that offered parades but little else. He thought of the Marine in Pennsylvania, whose PTSD medication ran dry because his claim was lost in a sea of bureaucracy, leaving him to battle his demons alone. He thought of the World War II nurse in Oregon, her identity questioned at a pharmacy counter because her VA ID was deemed outdated, her service reduced to a clerical error. He thought of the veteran in Missouri, who died in a hospital waiting room because the staff didn't understand VA billing, his life slipping away in a place meant to save him. These weren't just stories, they were wounds, raw and unhealed, shared by a brotherhood and sisterhood of those who'd served. Harold's response wasn't rage, it was resolve. He didn't raise his voice or demand attention. He simply picked up the phone, his hand steady despite the storm in his heart, and made a call. Not to the media, not for attention, but to the only avenue left when every other door had been slammed shut. The federal sedans that arrived later, the audit that followed, these weren't the heart of his story. What struck people wasn't the drama of government intervention, but the quiet strength of a man who'd waited decades for basic decency. Harold didn't ask for special treatment. He never had. He'd stood in line when his country called in him to war, and he'd stood in line ever since, for care, for respect, for the simple acknowledgement that his sacrifices mattered. His story resonated because it was the story of countless others. Veterans across America who didn't make the news but lived with the same quiet struggles. Emma Caldwell, the teller, wasn't a villain, though her actions cut deep. She was a product of a system that valued protocol over people, a system that trained her to act without questioning, to prioritize the institution over the individual. Her decision to shred the check wasn't born of cruelty, but of assumption, a snap judgment made in the absence of context. She didn't see Harold's veteran ID as a badge of honor. She saw it as irrelevant to her task. She didn't consider escalating the issue, didn't pause to wonder what the check meant to the man before her. In her mind, she was following rules, protecting the bank from a potential fraud. But in doing so, she tore open a wound far deeper than she could have imagined. Her fear-driven choice was a microcosm of a larger truth. Too often, the systems meant to serve veterans, banks, hospitals, bureaucracies, treat them as relics, burdens from a bygone era rather than pillars of a nation's strength. Harold's story hit a nerve because it laid bare what service looks like when the uniform is shed. It's not loud or demanding. It's a quiet resilience, a willingness to wait, to endure, to keep moving forward even when the world seems to have forgotten you. But there's a line, and when it's crossed, the response isn't fury, it's a steadfast determination to be heard. Harold's story wasn't just about one man or one check. It was a reminder of what veterans across America face every day. The struggle for care, for respect, for the basic humanity they have earned through their service. The real tragedy wasn't the shredded check. It was that Harold, and so many like him, didn't expect better. That's the wound that needs healing. The deeper issue is a disconnect between policy and principle. Policies are built to protect institutions, to streamline processes, to minimize risk. But principles are what protect people. The belief that every veteran deserves dignity, that their service demands not just gratitude, but action. Emma followed policy, or so she thought, but she abandoned principle. She acted without care, without curiosity, without the basic decency that Harold's life had earned. And in doing so, she became a symbol of a system that too often fails those it's meant to serve. America must do better, not with grand gestures or fleeting parades, but with the everyday respect that veterans deserve. It's not enough to thank them for their service. They need systems that work, clinics that are staffed, hotlines that answer, claims that are processed without delay. They need banks that see their IDs as proof of honor, not suspicion. They need hospitals that understand their needs, not waiting rooms where they're left to fade. Harold's story is a call to action, a reminder that service doesn't end when the war does. It's a plea for a nation to remember its pillars, to treat them not as relics, but as the foundation of its strength. Because the difference between policy and principle is the difference between a check and a man's dignity. And that's a difference we can't afford to forget. In the heart of a bustling bank branch, Emma Caldwell, a young teller with barely a year of experience, stood behind the counter, her fingers trembling slightly as she processed a stack of documents. Her eyes darted nervously, not out of malice, but from a deep-seated uncertainty that gnawed at her. She was new to this world of rigid protocols and endless regulations, and when faced with something unfamiliar, a worn Veterans Affairs check, she acted impulsively. In a fleeting moment of doubt, she shredded the document, not because she wished to harm, but because her inexperience left her grasping for control. Emma mistook her authority for wisdom, her quick decision a shield against the fear of making a mistake. Her heart raced as the paper turned to confetti, a quiet panic settling in as she wondered if she'd done the right thing. Deep down, she knew she hadn't, but admitting it felt like a defeat she wasn't ready to face. This wasn't just one teller's misstep. It reflected a broader, silent crisis rippling through modern institutions. The erosion of generational wisdom had left a void. Once, younger workers like Emma would have leaned on the guidance of seasoned mentors, absorbing lessons through observation and respect. Elders weren't just figures of authority, they were living archives of hard-earned knowledge. But somewhere along the line, that sacred exchange faded. Processes and checklists replaced mentorship. Instinct drowned out reflection. Decisions like Emma's stemmed not from a desire to do right, but from a paralyzing fear of being wrong. Her mind churned with self-doubt, her confidence brittle under the weight of policies she barely understood. In stark contrast stood Harold Monroe, a man whose presence carried the quiet strength of a life well lived. He didn't raise his voice or demand attention when he approached the counter, his Veterans Affairs check in hand. Harold, a veteran with eyes that held stories of sacrifice and resilience, stood with a dignity that didn't need to shout. His weathered hands, steady and sure, presented the check, not just a piece of paper, but a symbol of his service, his identity, his hard-won rights. When Emma, driven by suspicion and haste, shredded it, Harold didn't flinch. His heart ached, not for the loss of the check, but for the deeper wound, the system's failure to see him. Yet he remained composed, his silence a deliberate choice rooted in grace. Where Emma's actions were fueled by fear, Harold's were anchored in a profound understanding of who he was. He knew panic solved nothing, especially in the face of injustice. His stillness was not weakness, but a testament to a life that had weathered far greater storms. The moment in the bank transcended a single shredded check. It was a collision of values, a young woman's insecurity against a veteran's unshakable resolve. It laid bare what happens when institutions prioritize procedure over people, when ego overshadows experience. Harold didn't need to lecture or scold. His quiet presence was the lesson, a powerful reminder that dignity speaks louder than outrage. Emma, in her fleeting moment of authority, felt a pang of regret as she watched Harold walk away, his back straight, his steps measured. She couldn't shake the image of his calm, knowing eyes that seemed to see through her mistake to the deeper truth she hadn't yet grasped. Within 3 days, the bank's response was swift and public, a rare acknowledgement of failure that went beyond procedure. Consolidated Trust Bank issued a formal apology, not tucked away in fine print but boldly displayed in the local newspaper, posted on the branch's doors, and shared across social media. They named Harold Monroe, honoring him as a veteran and calling the incident a grave error in judgment. The apology wasn't just about a check, it was personal, a recognition of the man behind the paperwork. Emma Caldwell, her confidence shattered by the weight of her mistake, was quietly let go. The regional manager, who had initially defended her actions, was reassigned, his own judgment called into question. The branch underwent immediate retraining, not just in treasury protocols, but in something more fundamental: respect-based interaction, especially for veterans and the elderly. Emma, now jobless, grappled with the consequences, her mind replaying the moment she chose suspicion over understanding, wishing she'd paused to listen. The ripple effect reached far beyond the bank. In Washington, the Treasury Department took notice, rolling out a new mandatory training module across all federally insured financial institutions. Titled Veterans Are Not Variables, it emphasized the human element behind every document, the earned dignity of every VA-issued check, and the long, often arduous road veterans like Harold travel to receive what they're owed. The training wasn't just about rules. It was about seeing the person behind the paperwork, about honoring the sacrifices etched into every line of a veteran's face. For Harold, though, the public gestures meant little. He didn't crave the spotlight or the validation of headlines. His heart was elsewhere, focused on a journey far more personal. The following Friday, Harold packed a small duffel bag, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He folded his military jacket with care, its creases a map of his past, and walked to the bus depot in Bakersfield. The reissued check had cleared, his roof would soon be repaired, and his bills were settled. But those were just details. Harold's mind was on Eugene, Oregon, where a young boy named Caleb waited to meet his grandfather for the first time. As the Greyhound bus pulled out, Harold claimed the window seat, resting his chin on his hand, his eyes tracing the horizon. The road stretched ahead, and for once, it demanded nothing of him. No battles, no paperwork, no patience. Just presence. His heart swelled with quiet anticipation, imagining Caleb's face, the questions he might ask, the stories they'd share. This wasn't just a story about a check. It was about recognition, the kind that sees a person's worth beyond their ID or their age. Harold Monroe didn't storm the bank or demand justice. He stood still, his silence a powerful rebuke to a system that had forgotten the people it served. In a world that often overlooks those who move slowly or speak softly, Harold's quiet dignity was a reminder of what matters. His humility, rooted in principle, outshone the policies that failed him. His story challenges us to ask, have we lost the art of respect, or have we simply forgotten to teach it? In a fast-paced world, it's easy to dismiss someone like Harold, someone who carries themselves with old-school grace. But perhaps that's where we've strayed. Maybe what we need are more people like him, people who remind us that respect should never bend to bureaucracy, that dignity is owed to everyone, no matter how quietly they stand.